Should I take this off? Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last set of deep dives for Aspen Ideas Festival 2019. These are intended to be multiple part in order to have as broad a set of perspectives on an issue that you could, but this one may not go the full 90 minutes. However, maybe your questions will take it that way, because this will definitely have Q&A. This is a focus on zip code realities. And what I've learned in the course of putting together this program thread on economic progress, that so much is becoming understood across the United States, right down to the granular level of county by county economic opportunity, and now zip code by zip code economic opportunity, and what life looks like within those levels of American society. We thought that this kind of geography of opportunity would be a really interesting session. We're going to start off this afternoon with Andre Daly from McKinsey. He's a senior partner at McKinsey who is a specialist in higher education and many things like that, but he also is going to give you insights into this county level, what I would call heat maps, with some fascinating, maybe sobering data about where opportunity is going to exist in the next 20 years. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andre Daly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kitty. Who else had carbs for lunch? Because I think that's what I'm up against this afternoon. So look, I'm really excited to be here. McKinsey has a long program of research around the topic of future of work. And at its core, the question is, how is automation and technology going to change the workforce and the labor market as we know it? So there have been really two aspects to this work, and I'm going to concentrate more on the latter. But the first question is really, how will automation and other technologies cause jobs to be lost, gained, or transformed at the national level? And that tells you a pretty interesting aggregate picture. But as Kitty said, it doesn't tell you the picture about what's happening on the ground in local communities. And so we sought to answer the question of what would be the projected impact of automation, and we decided to look at about 10 years, on places and people at as granular a level as we could understand it. So that's really the work I wanted to share with you today. Let me start by saying much of the conversation about jobs being lost or has been about jobs being lost or displaced. And there is some of that. But in the work that we've done, what we've found is the following: that fewer than 10% of jobs really can be fully automated with today's technology. By far the more important transformation here is that there are about 60% of occupations which have at least 30% of the tasks that are automatable, which really means that this is predominantly a story of jobs being transformed rather than just jobs being lost. And I think that speaks to the fact that everyone in the workforce will experience some pretty significant shift in the nature of their job. The second thing I would sort of say from the national work is we basically looked at automation potential as it exists today. And what we found is that using currently demonstrated technologies, about 40% of work activities have the potential to be automated. But it really varies by industry. And really the last 15 years has been a story of automation in manufacturing. But the next 10 years it's going to expand significantly beyond that, as it has already started to do, into other areas like food service, retail trade, and the back office of companies, just to give a couple of examples. So that's the industry picture. Let me now take a look at the job picture. This chart has a lot of bubbles on it, but let me explain what it actually means. The bigger the bubble, the more jobs in that category. The bluer the bubble, the less educational skills are required for that job. So you can see office support, food service, production work. They're the jobs where, in general, fewer people have bachelor or more level credentials. And what you can sort of see is that the jobs with the greatest displacement potential also happen to overlap with those that have lower educational requirements. So that really says something about, and we'll see later, about the importance of education in being in professions which are less automatable. Now, I also want to share with you a little bit about the way in which the impact of automation will be felt by different demographic groups. And there's a lot of nuance in the research we did, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things. The first thing we found is that individuals with a high school diploma or less are 4 times more likely to be in an automatable job than someone with a bachelor's degree or higher. And they're 14 times more likely to be in an automatable job than someone with a graduate degree. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that because communities of color tend to have had more limited access to quality education in the past and currently, they're more vulnerable to being displaced by automation. So of all the racial and ethnic groups in our research, we found that Hispanic workers, for example, were in jobs that had a 25% or so likelihood of displacement due to automation over the next 10 years or so. The third thing I might highlight is that young workers are actually particularly susceptible going forward in our modeling to the vagaries of automation. So let me give you an example why. We think that jobs like retail and food service now present themselves for automation. And this creates a series of interesting challenges, which is, for many people in the past, these were the jobs that were the entry ramp into the workforce, and that's how you learned a series of skills which then carried. So the question is, what are the alternate pathways for young people? On the other end of the spectrum, there are workers aged 50 and over who are also at risk of displacement in certain categories, but they face a different series of challenges, the most significant of which is the difficulty in then getting into new jobs. If you look at people aged over 50 in the last recession, what you found is that of all age groups, they were the ones who after 9, 12, 18 months struggled the most to find themselves in new jobs. So these are some of the demographic groups that will face challenges as a result of automation. I want to skip ahead a little bit now and talk about place, about local communities. And I really want to share with you this new work we've done, in which what we did is we took all 3,069 counties in the United States, we took 315 cities, and for every one of them, we looked at the composition of jobs in the economy, we looked at the skills required for those jobs, we looked at which of those skills were automatable, and based on that, we made projections about job losses and also job gains. And what we found, very simply, is that this is not a simplistic story of rural versus urban. It's not a simplistic story of the heartland versus the coasts. It's not that the southeast is different to the northeast is different to the Pacific Northwest. It is a really granular story of each community is different. I know the next speaker, Mary, has done a lot of work on this, and she'll share more details. But so what I want to present to you is this extraordinarily complicated map. And let me tell you what this means, and I'm going to share with you a few findings from this. Basically, what we found is that when you look at economic health, business dynamism, industry mix, labor force characteristics, and about 60 characteristics, that the whole country can be divided into 13 segments which share similar characteristics. And if we wanted to, we could certainly have even more segments, but this is, in our view, a useful way to think about the different trajectory in which different communities might find themselves. So let me share with you some of the findings from this. There's a set of cities which we've called the urban core. Think of them as the 25 biggest or fastest growing cities. So we've called them the mega cities and the high growth hubs. They include cities like Atlanta, Chicago, Miami, New York, San Francisco. Or in terms of high growth hubs, they include the cities you've heard about: Austin, Charlotte, North Carolina, Denver, Nashville, Raleigh in North Carolina, and San Jose in California. So they are what we call the urban core. And let me sort of say they represent about 30% of the population. Since the recession, they've accounted for 2/3 of the net job growth. Those 25 cities, 2/3 of the national net job growth. And I'll tell you in a moment, the picture going forward looks very similar for those cities. But they're characterized by greater concentration of high-tech, media, healthcare, real estate, finance. They tend to be places where people have high incomes. There's faster employment growth. There's high net migration. They're younger. They're more educated, but they have high income inequality. And they tend to be characterized by congestion and affordable housing shortages, as many of us know. So that's the first broad category. I'm going to not talk about all 13. I'm going to talk about 5 broad categories. The second is the urban periphery. They happen to be the 270 counties around these cities, or around cities in the United States. They represent 15% of the population. They also have strong net migration as people want to be near job centers. And many people who live in the urban periphery go to work in the urban centers, the urban core. And they tend to have higher concentration of healthcare, retail, logistics, or service industries. And then people go to work in the big cities. So that's the urban periphery. There's then a set of what I would characterize as niche cities. They're about 50, 56 smaller cities, and they represent a much smaller fraction of the population, about 6%. But they include college-centric towns. They include Ann Arbor, Michigan, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, College Station in Texas. And then there's a group of what we call silver cities, which are retirement-heavy communities which are growing quickly. Asheville in North Carolina, Prescott in Arizona. I think you can probably guess there are a dozen or so of them in Florida. And then there are small powerhouses which in the last decade or two have really built economic clusters around technology and other industries. And a great example is Provo in Utah with technology, or Fort Collins in Colorado with aerospace and defense. But they're really clustered around a particular industry and they're growing quite quickly. And so these kind of cities, these niche cities, they're attracting workers and companies, and often there is a relatively lower cost of living and a higher quality of life. So these are the niche cities. In the middle, there are a set of cities which we've broadly characterized as the mixed middle. There's some economic vitality, not as much as the high-growth cities. There's stable cities like Cincinnati and St. Louis. There's smaller independent economies like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Winston-Salem in North Carolina. And there's some places where manufacturing still has some vibrancy, some more than others. Rockford, Illinois, Oshkosh, and Wisconsin. So they're slower in terms of economic and job growth. They tend to have higher unemployment, and they tend to have a moderately educated workforce. And that's about a quarter of the country, or 180 cities. And they require some really special attention as we think about the future. And the last category is perhaps the category which has some of the most challenging characteristics. I was struggling to figure out the right word to use for that without being overly negative. But I'd say there are 54 what we'd call trailing cities, really struggling cities. Flint, Michigan, Bridgeport, Connecticut. So there's about 50 cities. But in addition, there are 2,000 rural counties. 1,000 of them are weakly to mildly positive in terms of economic growth. The other 1,000 are really struggling. Economic growth is bad. Job creation is bad. They represent about a quarter of the country. And since the last recession, they've barely added any jobs whatsoever. So a quarter of the country, 2,000 counties, really, really struggling. What I'm now going to show you is a different map which takes all these counties, and what we did is we projected the job growth from now till 2030 in every one of these counties and in every one of these cities. Okay. Now I'm going to explain this map in a moment. The darkest orange are counties which we project in a midpoint automation scenario to have negative net job growth between now and 2030. That's about 2,000 counties. That's about a quarter of the country. The lighter orange is similarly anemic economic performance, about 0 to 5% net job growth. Then you've got the ones which you see shaded in blue, and the blue represents, the darker the blue, progressively the greater economic vitality in terms of net job growth. And the one thing I would say is I wouldn't consider this a prediction. It's one of many projections. We've made a series of assumptions about the characteristics of each of these markets. We've made assumptions about the automation potential. But impressionistically, what does it tell you? It tells you a couple of big things. The first is that the 25 cities I mentioned before are likely to account for 60% of net job growth. 25 cities, 30% of the population, 60% of net job growth between now and 2030. The other big takeaway, as you can see from the orange, is that there are 2,000 counties and trailing cities, which are about a quarter of the population, which will have flat to declining net job growth. And of course, this raises some very interesting questions about how to tackle this. What political implications does it have? What policy prescriptions do we need? So this is sort of the core of the research that we did. I'm going to just dig into this picture a little bit and show you a different view. This next chart takes the exact same data and says, what does this look like for each of the 13 segments? And the difference in this page is I've compared the 10 years since the 2007 recession to our projection going forward. So let me explain what that means. It says in megacities, for example, that there was 9% net job growth in the megacities from 2007 to 17, and we project 11% going forward in this midpoint scenario. And you can see the high growth hubs, the small powerhouses, the silver cities, the college-centric towns look like they'll have pretty significant or reasonable job growth. And if you look over to the far right-hand side, you see the two rural segments, one which is performing slightly better than the other, which we've labeled here Americana, and the other 1,000 counties, distressed Americana, which look like they could possibly have mildly negative job growth. Now, what you might have thought is that growing economic divergence might have prompted a wave of immigration from distressed areas to thriving job markets, or rather a wave of migration. But interestingly, that's not actually what the data shows. And I'm going to share with you some information about geographic mobility. And what's interesting about this is that geographic mobility in the United States has eroded to historically low levels. So whereas, for example, in 1990, 6% or a little over 6% of Americans moved between counties or states, in 2017, look at that chart. It's 3.6% in total. So we have about a little more than half the geographic mobility we had 25, 30 years ago. And that has historically been a way that the labor market has worked and people have found new opportunities as they've gone from areas with less vitality to areas with more vitality. Now, there's a lot of speculation about why that is. But I want to cover one more finding from our data, and let me explain what this is. This chart shows you the domestic outflow and the domestic inflow from the 5 different categories I showed you. So what does that show? It shows that between 2012 and 2016, 4.5 million people left the low growth and rural segments. Now, did they all go to the urban core where the jobs are? They didn't. What's actually quite striking about this analysis is it shows that when people in rural areas and less vibrant cities did move, they usually moved to places with a similar economic profile rather than to megacities or high-growth hubs. And we can all speculate why that is. There are a number of reasons: the cost of living, ties with family and friends, and as some people have talked about, the growing cultural divide and a feeling of belonging and so forth. But this paints a very stark picture of the challenge we face in economies that are diverging, but we don't have the geographic mobility that matches that. So perhaps with that, what I would like to do, because I've got a couple minutes left here, I want to just reflect on what I've shared with you and put into my own words a summary of what we found. I think what we found is that automation and other technology is going to cause displacement, and quite a lot of it. Maybe 40 million jobs displaced between now and 2030. But to put that in perspective, that change or churn in the jobs in the economy is actually pretty in line with recent historical precedent. In other words, you might say, or people have been saying, automation is completely different. This is a massive dislocation in the economy. Sure, there's going to be continued change. It's actually not that different than what we've seen in recent historic times. That's the second thing I'd take away from this. The third is there are many vibrant areas in the country. They're mostly cities. And there are many, many struggling ones. And they're mostly rural counties and some smaller declining cities which relied on manufacturing. And there is some real cause for concern when I look at this data. The first is, while the national picture is overall promising, if you think about the fact that 40 million people may be displaced from their jobs, I think one of the things that Mary and others have been talking about is that every one of those 40 million embodies a real human story and real disruption. So there is potential pain in this disruption as the nature of work changes. The other cause for concern, I would say, is that those with less education and communities of color are particularly vulnerable. The other thing I would also say is that mobility overall, but particularly to more vital areas, is low. And maybe that's because cities, at least in part, that are vibrant, have thrown up virtual gates. What are those virtual gates? They've limited the housing supply. They've underinvested in public transportation. And there are a range of reasons why, for many people, cities, even though vital, have become less active. So what can we do about this? I don't propose to cover this in this particular talk, but I'd offer two things. That the places that are improving, there's a full ecosystem of actors working together. It's companies working together with educational institutions and labor agencies and NGOs and industry associations and labor unions. That's where magic is happening and better than average performance. And I think the last thing is we're going to need to more fully deploy and scale things that we are seeing working in some parts of the country to others. So I would simply end by saying that what all this to me means is that there's a real opportunity to respond locally to reflect local economic circumstances. Thank you.
Okay. So the city of Chicago has a very rich civic culture. There are a million different community trusts and things like that. And Penny Pritzker is at the center of almost all of them.
Not hardly.
Penny has had a successful career in real estate investment. And of course, she was Secretary of Commerce under Barack Obama. Now, you have come back to Chicago.
Yep.
What are you doing there?
Well, besides my business life, what's interesting right now that I'm focused on is something called P33. So, and I think this research is really interesting. It was obvious coming back to Chicago that we're punching below our weight as a tech city. And we have all these great assets, but we're not making use of them and we're not benefiting from them. And so a guy named Chris Gladwin, who's a tech entrepreneur, considered a unicorn, built a company in Chicago, sold it to IBM for $1.4 billion. So he's a big deal. We have one in Chicago. And he said, he and I were talking about this. And so we got together and said, we're going to create an effort in our city to try and make Chicago a tier 1 tech hub. And we realized this is not a short-term effort, it's a long-term effort. And we began by going out to business leaders, leaders in our venture capital community, leaders in our universities, leaders in our incubators, our accelerators, and said, would you get involved? Nobody said no. Everybody said, because we showed them the preliminary data that said we're punching way below our weight. And so then we engaged with McKinsey and BCG and Accenture. In fact, they volunteered to help us, which was pretty amazing. And we did a year of research, which Oscar Munoz, the CEO of United, said, he said, if we don't get the research right, then the answers we come up with will be wrong. And we pulled together all of this data about ourselves, including surveys of 1,200 tech leaders around the country, to find out what do they think about Chicago. And of course, what we learned is that they love themselves, they love the cities that they're in, and we in Chicago, we love our city too, but we also learned that Chicago had the lowest score of technologists around the country about how they felt about other cities. So our Net Promoter Score, the differential was widest. And so that led us to say, okay, what are we going to do about it? And we really, after a lot of research, came to the conclusion we need to pick clusters of our economy that we're going to focus on and address the gaps in those clusters. And so we picked 4 clusters, and one is business IT, so think of information, managing information. Industry 4.0, think of advanced manufacturing, advanced logistics, advanced materials. Natural for Chicago, we sit in the middle of the country, like everything goes through Chicago. We have a great transportation hub. Third is food and ag. We're in the middle of the Midwest, so think of agricultural, biotechnology, new seeds, things like this, and process improvements in terms of food processing or food production or food availability. And then finally, health and life sciences, because we have some of the greatest established companies, whether it's Baxter, AbbVie, or Abbott in Chicago, and we also have some of the greatest research at University of Chicago and Northwestern. And so we picked these 4 clusters where we have an authentic right to win, and then said we're going to come together and we're going to work on 3 things. Commercializing our science. Second is creating an inclusive talent pipeline into each of these 4 areas. And third is tell our story, change our narrative.
Right. So if I understand it, you're not trying to create the next Google, you're trying to create technology within existing industries.
Yeah, basically, hopefully will come out of it is new companies. It'll also be companies that are small today. We have 10 really promising industrial tech startups. They're struggling to get traction with customers. They're struggling to grow or get venture funding. Chicago, it's interesting, the data, our venture funding is relatively small, but we have the number 1 outcomes in terms of return on investment if you invest in Chicago. We have produced the number 2 number of computer scientists in the world. I mean, in the nation, but they leave to go to the coast. Gotcha. And so what do we do?
Okay, let me ask a rude question. I used to cover the Soviet Union for the Wall Street Journal, and there was a steel plant I went to see, and I happened to see it when there was a Japanese steel executive there. And the Soviet steel executive asked the Japanese executive, how far behind are we to you? Are we 8 years behind? Are we 10 years behind your technology? And the Japanese executive said, you're forever behind. Because not only were they ahead, they were improving faster. So that's the rude question about Chicago. Like San Francisco, Boston, they have well-established networks, they have cultures. Why should Chicago think about tech as opposed to all the other industries it could go into?
Because tech is a part of everything. And what we have is we have these incredible assets. We have great universities in Northwestern, University of Chicago, U of I, which is producing the computer scientists that are going to the coast. We also have 35 of the Fortune 500 headquarters. We've got great incubators and accelerators. And what we found is people are just working in their silo, doing their thing, and not working together. And the solutions are being looked for elsewhere as opposed to taking advantage of the assets where we have an authentic right to win in these 4 clusters.
Now, when you were Commerce Secretary, your purview was the entire country. And so there was a lot, I assume, emphasis on national policy making. Now you're back doing local development. How do you think about those 2 different scales?
Well, I think that, at the end of the day, most things that get executed locally. And, what we've been is in Chicago, humble about what we're good at and humble about what we're not so good at and trying to figure out and learn from others. And I think that in terms of, Chicago's a 3rd largest city in our country. We need, as a country, Chicago to be successful. We don't want it to fail. And according to McKinsey's study, we're large. We may not be growing as fast, but we're at least large. And so we have a ton of assets to deploy. Why should we waste all that? And frankly, if you look at global competition, we can't afford to, waste our assets in this country.
Okay, another rude question. You're a leading figure in the city. Your time and your resources are scarce. Could I argue that if you're going to improve tech and that's going to be your focus, it'll be great for the lakefront and not so great for the rest, it won't matter as much to the rest of the
But
city?
that's the whole point about an inclusive talent pipeline. It's really about our south and our west sides. And so this is very much consistent with the mayor's focus on our neighborhoods. It's very much consistent with what the business leaders in our city recognize need to happen, which is we need to make it easier for someone who grows up 10 miles away from where my kids grew up, that they have as much an opportunity in terms of education and pipeline to get into taking advantage of the clusters and the jobs that are being created.
So do you have ideas for that? I was just with the head of the Chicago schools.
Yes.
And Janice they've had amazing gains. I mean, it's the
It's
number one
incredible.
growth city, as a certain ex-mayor reminds me every 45 seconds. And so how exactly are you going to integrate the kids who are now getting through school, getting to community colleges? Do you have a specific plans to get them into tech?
So we're right at the point where we're beginning to develop those initiatives. But my expectation of what we will do is to integrate the efforts going on in terms of commercialization with the training to make sure that this training is available. And it means we're going to have to look all the way down into middle school. As you know, You've written about this. It's not just starting in college that you figure this out. Kids have got to become aware. Families have got to understand the opportunity. That's why we have to tell our story, not just to other cities around the country and around the world. We have to tell our story to our own families about here's the opportunity. I mean, when I was growing up, it was, become a doctor, lawyer, or, something like that. It was a ticket out of or a ticket to opportunity. Today, it's cybersecurity. Today, it's advanced computing. Today, it's AI. Today, it's machine learning. Well, you say that to and I saw this as Secretary of Commerce, you say that to a parent who has no clue exactly what you're talking about, and they're like, okay, I get it, but how do I help my kid get access to that? And so it needs to be, it will start with, Janice, and she's completely on board and understands. It starts with Juan Salgado, who's also here in our community colleges. And then it goes all the way up through whether it's Illinois Tech or University of Chicago and on and on. We've got to have greater connection of all of that.
Just a final couple of questions. What'd you learn being Commerce Secretary you didn't know before?
Oh God, a lot of things. A lot of things. Very humbling. I learned a lot about government. And I also learned a lot about managing at scale and inspiring people. And one of the things I learned is about that our federal workforce is highly undervalued and that we treat them terribly. And if I were running any kind of business and treated my workforce that way, they'd up and quit. We tell them that we shut down the plant, we shut down the government, we tell them we're not going to pay you, but you have to show up. Then we say we're going to pay you who showed up, but we're also going to pay the people who didn't have to work. I mean, it's crazy the way we run our government. And the other thing I learned is, at some point you need to think about restructuring government. It's as I've said to Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, imagine if Microsoft in its 45-year history had never restructured. Think about what the change that we just talked about, and we haven't restructured how we've thought about running government. It's kind of nuts.
Just to underline that, whenever I get to sit in on a government meeting, I'm always impressed by the professional people there, the career people. They're astonishingly talented, not making all that much money. It's always very impressive.
Well, Jim Fallows asked me on a panel about the deep state, and I said, you mean the 5 Nobel Prize winners at the Department of Commerce, the people with extraordinary expertise about trade around the world? I mean, it's amazing, and it was a real privilege to work with those folks.
And one final question. If I read that graph correctly, a third of the country will get getting 2/3 of the growth.
Yes.
How do we think about that problem?
That's a terrible problem. We've got to figure out, I think this challenge of mobility is a really serious issue, and I think the point about housing, it's very much connected to, that's great, I should move, and because the job opportunity, but I can't afford to move, I can't afford a house, I can't afford to live there, and oh, by the way, there's so much congestion, even when I can find a house anywhere close or a place to live, I can't get from there to my work. And that's a lot about underinvestment in infrastructure.
Okay. Well, I ask rude questions because that's what I do. But Penny Pritzker has been, for all of us who love Chicago, we have a lot to thank Penny for.
Well, David, we have a lot to thank you for. You enlighten and educate us every week, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Penny Pritzker.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Now I thought I'd just sit here and talk to you by myself. No, I'm going to bring up Mary Daly, who's the chairman of the San Francisco Fed. But while we do that, we are going to show a short video.
It's often said that zip code determines destiny. And one young woman who I met said, that is so discouraging because I grew up in a zip code that doesn't look very promising. And that nearly broke my heart. Zip Code Economies was born out of a moment of, I would say, almost despair on my part. My zip code here, where I've lived for 22 years, is 94610. And it looks so completely different than the zip code I grew up in, Baldwin, Missouri, zip code 63011. And I can stand in both communities and see that the people share the same goals. And if we share the same goals, how is it the divides are so big? And I decided it was important that we build a bridge. So we made Zip Code Economies to let people see that everyone else is just like them. Shared goals, shared values, just living in different parts of the country. Economic research tells us that zip code is destiny. But what I learned is that that is not always true. When you hear the people's stories, when you hear that communities can create not only hope, but opportunity, that they rally together for one another, and that only thing they desire is to give back and contribute and make the lives of future generations better than the ones that they have, it's inspiring. Economics is about people. This is a show about people and about community and about how they come together to make change and make the world a better place than what they inherited.
Welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
Now let's first start with you. You're a trained economist,
I am.
and so you were raised in a certain way. Where'd you get your PhD?
I got my PhD at Syracuse University.
Okay. And you were raised with a certain model of human nature and with certain data sets and skill sets to measure how humans behave. You seem to have semi-rejected that for a more human scope of how to understand people.
You know, it's interesting. So because of my past, and many of you may not know this, so I lived in a lower income family in Baldwin, Missouri. We lived with, we were pretty close to the bone, so we were one economic or health shock away from falling through. And when I was 15, we fell completely through. And so I dropped out of high school and I worked and I saw these types of people just be displaced. And then I went on to get an economics PhD and studied the data, but I really never forgot where I came from. And so more than rejecting it, I feel like I'm augmenting it. I got the skill set that will make me credible in the world of policy. And then I'm going back to grab the people that tell the stories about why we make policy in the first place.
Yeah. So tell us, you know, I've been on a journey for this Weave thing I do with Aspen, and you've been on a journey, and you find very distinct places and very powerful people. So could you just tell us some of the stories you heard that left a mark on you?
Well, to be honest, Zip Code Economies is the most transformative project. It's the best thing I've ever worked on in my career. And when I read about Weave, we're all trying to do the same thing, which is to surface the stories of people who have, despite considerable challenges, you know, made their way and found a way to contribute. And so one of the places we go, no matter where we go to visit, we always go to a local school. And in Faribault, California, which is the first place we visited, and just to give you a little bit, that has a town of 8,700 people. It's located outside of Fresno. It is 87% first-generation immigrant. It is primarily a place where people come to work in the field, largely from Mexico right now, and they come because they want their kids to have better access to education. And you think, they're the fifth poorest community in America, and you think, well, you know that place, until you look at the next statistic. 97% of those kids graduate from high school, and 77% of them go on to some sort of higher learning. And then they often choose to come back and work in Fireball to lift their communities up. And those were stories of not just people, individual people, but an entire community that had that as their moral ecosystem, as you've said. You know, they're rallying around that. And a similar story comes out of East Palo Alto, which is 2.6 square miles surrounded by tech giants. And somehow they manage to have a community where love is the thing that they transfer, and that love generates mobility. And so while they have these challenges, and that the slides we saw about communities from Andre are so, they take your breath away almost, there are communities out there who live in those left behind that are still not leaving themselves behind.
Yeah. Do they have basic faith in the system? There's a lot of discussion of capitalism may be broken. How do they think about it? How do you think about it?
They do have, this is the most remarkable thing that I found in terms of how they relate to the economic system. They do have faith in the general economic system, but what they want is a place to participate. So I went in thinking they really might want voice, and what I realized in the end of the journey is they want agency. And the agency and the voice together gives them a place at the table. This woman named Amika, who runs the East Palo Alto Academy, she says, I start right at the beginning telling people we need, these are 5th graders, 6th graders, sit up straight in your chair because we need you. You need to participate in your education because we need you around policymaking tables if we're going to bring others along. And the students do it. And then they end up majoring in things like neuroscience. I mean, it's just, it's quite remarkable, but it isn't as we often hear it, that they want to divorce themselves from society. They just want to have their rightful place at the table, and they think their time is now.
And is education the source of agency? Is that
it is the source of agency, and that's the thing that if you go to any of the communities we went to, they really drill down on this idea that education is their mobility. And I'll tell you something they're actually quite agitated about, is that there's a big debate. It largely takes place, and I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but it largely takes place among academics and people who have their children going to 4-year colleges about whether 4-year colleges are for everyone. And then you go to a community of color or low income and they say, that's our ticket out. So yes, we're going to have apprenticeships, and yes, we're going to have opportunities for people, but let's not ignore that the best way to get ahead in the United States is to get a college education. And instead of saying, well, they're not ready, let's go wonder why they're not prepared. And I thought that was really a great learning. It gave me insight into, we need to listen to the people in those communities to know what they want.
Yeah. Raj Chetty was here earlier in the week, and he has extremely granular data, really block by block.
It's amazing data.
Yeah. And what's impressive about it is how what he measures is, say, he measures mobility. Say you grew up in a family earning $26,000. What are the odds that a child in that family will rise to, say, $50,000? And demographically similar neighborhoods just across a boulevard, radically different outcomes. Some kids staying at 26, half a mile away, going up to 50. How do we think about that? Like, why does that phenomenon exist?
So one thing that, not using Raj Chetty's data, but using just more aggregated data that I find, is a statistic I come back to again and again, is that if you look at kids born into the lower part of the income distribution, and you look at the chances they get up, it all has to do with whether they get a 4-year degree. And you think, oh, well, that's the magic bullet. But then you look at the fact that only something like 9%, depending on who you're calculating, it's all under 10% of those kids ever get a 4-year degree, then it just reminds me that again and again and again, it's about getting education, and then why one block has it and one block doesn't. What I have found by going in and doing zip code economies is it's largely that these localities have to wrap around. They have to have parents, teachers, the students, and the local government all saying we're going to swim in the same direction, and that direction is our future generations have to have a better opportunity than we're sitting in right today.
Yeah, when I was listening to Raj, I was thinking, on Halloween, I live in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. On Halloween, there are some blocks that are awesome blocks. My block is not an awesome block, so we don't get that many kids. But 3 blocks over, there's a street which is an awesome block. So why is that awesome?
Right.
It's because there are 3 or 4 magnetic families who decided to make it awesome.
Right.
And it's actually individuals even who create a local culture.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that we heard again and again when we went out and did the zip code economies is that, and you've all had this experience, I'm sure. Remember back when you were kids, and maybe you lived in this family, maybe you went to this family. There were families on the block who were the families that when you walked in the door, this is what I would do, I'd walk in the door and they'd say, "Mary!" And they'd be so excited and they would embrace me and all the love they had for their family kind of got poured onto me. And what we found is that there are people in these communities who are those people, and they embrace. And then what happens is it's a virtuous cycle as opposed to the negative cycle that we often hear about. The question is, how do we give those people, how do we lift them up so that someone in another community, maybe they become the advocate for that? Right. And that's where I think, if you look at Raj Chetty's data, the key, and it's not a policy goal as much as a key is if we spread what can work, maybe the person over the next block says, okay, I'm going to be that person, I'm going to be that family.
Yeah. I love an emotional economist.
That's a good thing, I think.
Yeah, it is a good thing.
It's a swimming upstream thing if you're an economist, but you get to it, it's okay.
Now, one of the weavers we brought to Aspen is a guy named George. He lives in North Wilkes, North Carolina. And it's a town that has a very clear history. Lowe's Hardware was started there. NASCAR was partly started there. I think there was a Holly Farms there, Yala Furniture. It all went away. They collapsed in the 90s, had the opioid crisis before the rest of the country. And now they're trying to dig it up. And so the question I think about for kids in that community which we visited is, should I stay or should I go?
Right.
So, and Andre talked about the mobility,
right.
What's the right answer? Or what's the right proportion of answer? And then what do you think about the drop in American mobility? Did you get any insights into that?
Sure, it's concerning about the drop in economic or geographic mobility that Andre just clearly showed. And we've been puzzled as economists, researchers for a long time about why it fell off. But if you look at that map that Andre showed, you really start to get a indication that geographic mobility alone won't solve the issues. There's just too many parts of the United States who are going to be left behind. And so then it's about, maybe getting some geographic mobility so that children go away and then they come back. Because if we don't do that, if we don't start creating some vibrancy in these communities that are going to be left behind, we're going to end up with very localized pockets of success and a vast swath of the American geography that's completely left behind. And this is going to interrupt a lot of things. One of them is the aggregate statistics that we're computing to do most of our policy are no longer going to reflect anyone's experience. They're going to just be the average of a bimodal distribution of experiences. The other thing I'm going to say is that we're leaving so much talent on the table and we're facing a very slow growth economy in the future. The next 20 years is not going to look like the last 50 years in terms of growth rates. But the only way to change that equation is to make some of those orange areas, I think they were orange, Andre, to make some of the orange areas more like blue areas, to really start to lift up this and stop leaving talent on the table and try to bend this curve or change the speed limit, whatever metaphor you like, but to just get more engagement.
Yeah. So how local should we think about policymaking? Is the most important policy lever at the national level? Or would it be nice if there was a national policy lever, but we've just got gridlock in Washington, so we have to think local? Or should we just be thinking local?
So I have to say I've spent my entire career studying public policy. Monetary policy is something that I gained experience in, but public policy was my passion, fiscal policy, if you would. And this is the age-old question, how do we do it best? In my current world, and I look around, what I find is that people would like it if our national policy had more momentum than it currently does, but they also recognize that national policy sometimes it's a one-size-fits-all program, but at the local level, communities are quite different. There's quite a lot of heterogeneity, and one woman said to me, you can't just give us money and a plan. You have to give us freedom to again, have our own agency. And so some combination is the right answer. The problem is combinations are complicated, and we don't really think hard about how do we get freedom to apply things and use the money or the resources or the overarching desires to do local policy. So I'm on the local side a little bit more than I used to be when I first started out of grad school, but I think it takes both.
Yeah, I have a friend who works at the American Enterprise Institute, and she's worked there a while, and she said it used to be people would come and be our interns, and then they'd get a job in Congress.
Right.
And now they come and be interns, and then they go home to serve in their own communities, because that just seems more interesting to them.
Well, I worked with a young man at AEI. We were doing something on disability policy, and he left. And I said, "Oh, why did you leave? You were such a great resource." He said, "I'm going back to Michigan because I want to work locally because that's where I see I can measure the impact year to year of my contributions or and I can change on a dime. I'm much more agile. So I think this is the wave of the future."
Yeah. Let's go back to particular stories of people you met. I'd just love to get a sense of what their dreams are. What do they think of? I want to work in a big corporation, or I want to work in I want to be an entrepreneur. Were you surprised by one direction or another that it went?
So this was, I asked a series of simple questions. Why do you live in your community? What do you hope for your community? What would you like to see for yourself? And the answers I got, and especially about the economy, were that they didn't have, my generation, I feel like we picked a career goal, and we said, we want to get there. And they're saying, I want to make a contribution, I want to have a skill set that allows me to move flexibly back and forth, and I want to be able to respond to the ever-changing economy. And so they found, they were very inspiring because these young people were talking about having a toolkit that they could take to do the things that their heart drew them to. I mean, I just read your book, Second Mountain, and I actually think that so many of these young people, that's already in their line of sight. So they're not so focused on achieve for the achievement's sake itself. They're focused on build for the contribution they can see themselves making. And that happened again and again and again. And one young man, since you asked me for a specific story, told me that he wanted to be able to lift his community up. So he was an officer, he trained to be a police officer. He said, I have many more opportunities, he's from Fireball, many more opportunities to rise up if I went outside, but I want to give back to my community because my community helped me be able to become an officer. So he's there working on the soccer league, helping young people, and that's his vocation.
Yeah, I find especially among younger workers, there's the generalities are true. They want to bring their whole person to work. Mm-hmm. They want to have their best friends at work.
Yes.
They want to be treated like a whole person. My team asked, some of the younger people on my team asked if we could all share our childhood photos so we get to know each other better.
Absolutely.
I was trying to imagine when I was young, asking William F. Buckley to, Bill, I think I want to show you my childhood. Like, it's so generationally different.
It's completely different. But can I ask you a question? So how do you think you would have felt, or I often ask myself this is why I'm asking you, how do you think you would have felt if that was the world you grew up in? If he had asked you, hey, bring in a family photo, I'd like to really see that.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I think there's some virtue in deference, and knowing that I'm 23, I really should not be running this company.
Right.
But on the other hand, bringing the whole self to work, I think is an overwhelmingly good thing.
Yeah.
I worry a little about, are we really friends if we're on the same company, if we have to make decisions which mar our relationship, and maybe it's better to have more distant relationships. I think there's some tension there. But I think we're going through a whole person revolution in every field. Well, healthcare is not just treating the body.
Right.
Schools are not just treating a brain on a stick. Everybody's emotional life is all involved, and I think that's overwhelmingly, generally a completely wonderful thing.
Yeah,
my
me
wife
too.
wrote a book on organizations that transform lives. And it was supposed to be for nonprofits, but a lot of the interest has been these aging boomer CEOs who've got to deal with these kids who want to have a moral crusade in the workplace. And how do I deal with these guys?
Right. No, I face this in the Federal Reserve. We have 1,700 employees, and we want to attract and retain younger talent. And you're right, there is this combination of recognizing it takes a while to build skills, and experience does have value, but also learning, and I feel like I'm always in this reverse mentoring relationship where I'm getting a lot of information from younger people about how they want to live, and then using that to set the strategy for our bank and what we do. And that balance is hard, but it's back to where the question you asked me about federal versus local policy. The world's just more complicated, and I think having a little bit of this nuance it's going to be hard. We'll bump into each other, but it's likely to be super better than otherwise.
Yeah. Let's get depressing here. You talked about younger people. Let's talk about some older people.
Okay.
And so I met a guy in South Dakota after I wrote In 2015, I wrote 800 columns on the theme, "Don't worry, Donald Trump will not get the Republican nomination." And I realized that year I was living in Washington. A lot of my life was in New York, and I was teaching at Yale. So I'm on the Acela, so how could I get out of touch with America? And so I went out after I was wrong, and I spent almost every week since somewhere in the country. And I met a guy in South Dakota who had his best job at 35, and every successive job was worse. And he told me the best day of his life. He had this job when he was 35, and the plant got new technology, new equipment that he was not qualified to supervise. And so he thought he'd just quietly slip away. And so he packed up his office, he had his box, he opened the door, he was just going to slip away. And the 3,500 employees of that plant had formed a human tunnel all the way from his office door to his car door. And he had to walk through the human tunnel, and they applauded him all the way out. And that was like the best moment of his life. But everything else, he just wasn't qualified for a lot of the jobs. The jobs weren't there. South Dakota, this part didn't have a growing economy. There was no fracking or anything like that. Did you encounter that kind of stuff? The stuff that explains the election of Trump and other anxieties.
So I'm going to go back to a story from Fireball, because they have one of the most well-developed understandings of that phenomena that I have witnessed. So in Fireball, as I mentioned, people come, they often leave jobs in Mexico, where a young man told me that his parents were, his mom was a social worker, his father was a veterinarian. They migrate to the US so that their kids can go to school, and they work in the fields. And what the people it's West Hills Community College, what they recognized is we are, again, leaving so many people disenfranchised, because the best time of that gentleman's life, or that mom's life, was probably the day they crossed the border, because they have so much hope for their kids, but their careers peaked when they were 35. And so what seems just obvious, but not been traditionally something we've focused on in the United States, is why do we think that your education stops when you're 22, and then you don't have the technology sophistication to engage in the new work? I mean, if you're 35, well, I'm still learning, and I'm not 35. You can learn all the time, but we don't really have that mindset of lifelong learning, growth mindset. And I don't think, what I learned in the zip code is, it's not that individuals don't have a growth mindset, it's that we don't have an infrastructure or a societal embracing of a growth mindset. So then people get to be 35, and it's the best moment of their lives. And that's just, we're missing. I mean, we don't have the luxury of letting that talent go anymore. We might have used to when we were growing at 3.5% without them, but we're not doing that anymore. But two, it's just not, it doesn't make sense in a country that's supposed to have an inclusive economy, to me.
Yeah.
So that's what I tell them. And I think, if I was going to focus on things, which I'm doing, I would focus on building educational opportunities for younger people so they can engage, but also not forgetting that older workers, and 35 is not that old, but older workers at all kinds of generations are able to engage in the economy and give back, and they have experience that's very valuable for the younger workers they're assisting.
Sociologists pay a lot more attention to demographics or ethnic qualities than economists do. And in Nebraska, one of the places I was, it was a town probably not like the place outside of Fresno, where about 30% of the population were Latino, but they might as well have been living in two different worlds. There was not much cultural interaction, probably workplace interaction, but only in the most superficial sense, and therefore you did not have the advantage of the strength of weak ties. Mm-hmm. Is that something you encountered?
So this is where it's the remarkable part we uncovered that, frankly, I was surprised about. This is why I call it a transformative project, is whether we went to, Fireball, California, East Palo Alto, Salt Lake City, a much bigger area, where when I started working at the Fed in 1996, the predominant faith, by a large majority, was Mormon, but now it's not the predominant faith anymore, it's 40%. And what I found is the only way those communities work is when they have actual connections. They have collaborative connections, but somebody's got to have fostered that. And so let me take Salt Lake. In Salt Lake, they have a whole system where they bring local government together with businesses, partnering with not-for-profits, mixing individuals who have completely different faiths together because they realize that's their only path forward. So I was intrigued by that because we often think that we sort into tribes and that will make us feel protected, and you've noted that in your work, but it actually is completely the opposite. And that's one message I kept hearing loud and clear is tribalism is a very bad outcome in the United States. And the communities that we went to where we told the success stories were ones where they had abandoned tribalism for the idea that the community is the most important thing. It was actually very inspiring, and the fact that they could actually do it. We would go around these communities and they'd be sitting around the tables with each other. They knew about each other's families. They would lift everybody up. I was surprised by this.
That's one of the things
and
I learned.
Encouraged.
We used to think the individual, we want the kid who's going to be the entrepreneur and become a star, but it's important to think that the neighborhood is the unit of change.
Right, the neighborhood is
Neighborhoods
the unit.
rise and fall together. A friend of mine in Shreveport says, you can't only clean the part of the swimming pool you're swimming in.
Right.
You have to clean
That's very
the
true.
whole, you have to clean the whole.
So can I say one thing about the neighborhood, because I thought this was something that really came out of Salt Lake, is there was a young intern who worked for us in the Federal Reserve. He came from Brigham Young University, and he and I were talking. He's on the podcast, and we're talking. So he's Mormon, obviously. He's going to leave our internship early to get married at 22, and wants to have his family. And he said, what I've been asking myself is whether we want to talk about neighbor with a capital N, and who really is my neighbor, and how do I love them, and what should I be doing for them? And it was really a remarkable moment because he has this idea that neighborhoods make change, but in order for neighborhoods to make change, you have to have this idea of neighbor with a capital N, an inclusive neighbor, not just a next door neighbor that you look like or got educated like or any of those things.
Yeah, Raj Shetty, when he was asked what are the microcultures that really do well, they've got good schools, they've got strong families, and they've got good social connections.
Right.
And even if a kid grows up in a family with a lot of fathers, even if he doesn't have a father in the home, that still helps.
That still helps. I mean, that's another thing that I learned from, we went to Honolulu. So if you go to Honolulu, everybody thinks of the beach and the fish and tourism, but we went and talked to the people who live there all the time. They're not the tourists. And one of the things that comes out is this idea of ohana. And ohana is this family. And I asked, well, can you just describe it? And she said, in the Hawaiian culture, there is no family that would feel wealthy if another family had less. So there's this bonding together and this idea that the social network, you give that back. That's your wealth. And if you find a family with has a missing parent or just less opportunity, you surround them and lift them up. And that's the intergenerational transmission of hope and opportunity in their minds.
Okay, we're going to go to questions in just 1 minute. I'll just tell one story that I've probably told earlier in the festival. We have a friend named Travian Shorters who lives in Miami, and he ran into a woman who was helping kids cross the street out of elementary school. And he asked her, do you volunteer in your community? And she said, no, I don't have any time to volunteer. And he said, well, are you getting paid now? And she said, no. And then he said, what are you doing this afternoon? She said, on Thursdays I take food to the sick people in the hospital. And he said, do you have any time to volunteer? No, I have no time to volunteer. Because she just thought that's what neighboring was. Like, it's not volunteering, that's what you do.
That's what you do.
And I was reminded that until, I think the word altruism did not exist, the concept of altruism did not exist until like the 18th century, because until you decide that people are basically selfish, you don't need a word for altruism because that's what people are. But once you decide people are selfish, you have to invent a word for when they're not behaving selfishly.
Right.
But
that's the one part of economics I've rejected fully from my experience is that economists tend to narrowly define what we call the objective function, and in that is written all these things about achievement and income, and what's missing out of that is that people actually love social connection, they love social ties, and they'll give up a lot of things in order to get them. And I think that's where we need to head if we want to make that map that Andre showed or the information Raj Chetty gave us. That's how we change that equation.
Yeah. Questions? Let's start way over there.
Earlier in the week, the Philadelphia Fed president was here talking about his activity and that your innovative activity. What's going on with the Fed? Why aren't we hearing more about these wonderful programs that are going on? It's fantastic that, 2 in 1 week, never heard of them.
So we're working on this. We are really so here's how the Fed has traditionally worked. I'm not speaking for anyone else in the Fed. That's why I always have the disclaimer. I'm speaking for myself, but these are my impressions. That for the longest time, and I'm really against this, we thought that the best way to protect our reputation was to go inside a castle and guard it. And then we are learning that you can only guard something for so long because over time it just diminishes into irrelevance. So what we're doing now is we're being outward facing. We are public servants and we're being other focused, not only in what we do, but in how we dialogue. And I think we're in the very beginning of that. You saw Chair Yellen when she had the chair, and then Chair Powell now engaging. We're on a Fed Listens tour, for example. But we're in the infancy of this, and what we're doing right now is simply trying to share the programs. I've been working on zip code for 2 years. We just launched it on Friday. We're trying to share this, but I want everybody here, if you can take away one thing about the Fed, that we have this new mindset, which you can see spreading across all the banks, and that is, we are your Fed. And so that's different than an institutional mindset where we'll pronounce and hope you like it. It's more of we are your Fed. So you'll see more and more of this, but I totally agree with you that we've been short on telling our own story and thus not really explaining how community interested we are in the lives of the people we serve.
How should we think about the fact that one of the best institutions in our government is least connected to elections and politics? Maybe democracy wasn't a good idea. No. No, how do you think about that?
Well, this is something that I think a lot about, but I don't think about it quite like you framed it. I think about it in that, what's the value of Fed independence? And one of the things that's valuable about Fed independence is that we have a variety of different ways in which people come around that FOMC table. So if you're a governor, you're getting nominated, and then Congress appoints you, says yes, confirms you. But if you're at one of the regional Feds, the 12 regional Feds, that's one of my roles, then you've been elected or chosen through a search by the board of directors, which are themselves, by definition, business leaders, and bankers can't be involved in this. So these are business leaders and community leaders and labor leaders. And that blend has its own value. And then the most important thing that happens in the Fed is when you go into the FOMC, it's a big room, probably seen pictures of it, you cross this threshold. I would actually like this idea of ceremonial crossings where you cross the threshold and you put all of your own personal views aside about if you were king, what would you do? And instead you listen to the other members on the committee and you reach a decision that is what you think is the best view, what we can do most to achieve our goals and serve the American people. And then I have this mantra that I use for myself. The best policymakers, and these are my colleagues at the Fed, where we do all our work, we do the best we can, and we're confident about the decision. We're curious. I guess we start with curiosity, want all the data. Then we're confident when we take the decision. But then the minute we walk out, we're humble about whether that decision is the right one for tomorrow. And so I like this idea of humility, which we heard from Penny, and it's just this idea that you have to be humble and constantly curious, confident, humble to be able to do your job well.
Okay, I think we had a question right over here.
Hi, I'm Isabel Ruyan. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I'm working towards rebuilding my island. And my question is to Andre. Is Puerto Rico included in this study? And if it's not included, I ask that it should be included to this study and this sort of study so that we can finally become part of the conversation. And especially considering McKinsey has charged my island $73 million consulting for the Fiscal Oversight and Control Board.
No. Yes. There's probably only one good answer to that, which is that Puerto Rico will be in the analysis if it's not already.
Very political. Well played. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, I see a question right here. I see two in a row. We'll do.
Awesome. I'll take it. Hi, I'm Jovian Zane. I do work around purpose, and I'm very curious, Mary, and you too, David, your why, like your why in your work. And I can imagine that's evolved over time. And in particular, Mary, I'm curious, as you've gotten into the zip code economies work, what is one particular lesson or story or something that touched you that fundamentally shifted the way you show up in life right now, and that has impacted the way you think about your purpose during this chapter of life? And David, you too, and I know you're on the second mountain, which we love, as you think about how you've been operating through the WEAVE program.
You want to go first?
And after you.
Okay. So it's going to be hard to pick a single thing because I feel like the whole experience of zip code changed me so fundamentally. So I have always been, just because of my own upbringing, a person that has gratitude and has a sense that the only reason I got there was because people helped lift me up. And if I don't turn back every day, essentially, and try to give back to that, then I'm not doing my part. I'm not doing my part at all. But what happens oftentimes when you study economics for a living is you become very focused on the data. And so the most transformative thing that happened to me is that I'm very familiar with the maps that Andre showed. I'm very familiar with statistics that tell you that zip code determines destiny. And I am holding myself accountable to the following thing. The data alone, the kinds of things we can tabulate and measure, don't tell the stories of the American people and so we're looking at an incomplete picture. So my commitment is to be not just an economist who sits inside my room and tabulates, but actually an economist and a person who goes out and sources from the people in those communities. What do you think about your situation? What would you like to have? So my contributions now have changed in my mind when I think, what am I contributing? I'm as likely to stop and ask somebody what their experience has been as I am to look at a statistic. And I think that I know, well, it's not even I think, I know that's made me a better person, it's made me a better economist, and it's made me a better leader.
Yeah, I guess I would say I started WEAVE partly because 45,000 people kill themselves every year, 72,000 die of drug addiction, our democracy's in peril, people are bitter and angry. And to me, these reminded me of George H.W. Bush. He's walking across the Yale Quad, and he hears about Pearl Harbor and walks right into the recruiting station. And these seem to me like silent Pearl Harbors. And they call on all of us to do something extra. And so we all have to do something beyond what we normally do. And so to me, that was trying to see how to investigate the people who are rebuilding community and solving the crisis of disconnection we have in the country. And I think the surprise of it was it kicked my ass off the journalistic perch. Journalism, I tell journalism students, I mentioned this last night, if everyone around you is doing the wave and you don't do the wave at a football game, then you have the right kind of aloof personality type to be a journalist. Like, we don't do stuff, we watch stuff, and then we write about it. And the new book is a barrier between us and the world, and we're very comfortable there. But so I'm out near Athens, Ohio, and I'm with a woman named Sarah, and she's telling me about coming home from antiquing, and she walks in the door, and she says, "I'm home," and silence. She thinks her kids are playing trick or treat. There's the mattress on the door to the stairway down to the basement. She walks down and sees her husband slumped over, and then sees one of her kids on the sofa with what she thinks is chocolate all over the sofa. And she touches him, and the kid is cold, and her husband had killed their kids and himself. So you sit in there with this woman, and you can't help but be emotionally opened up by these experiences. And so to analyze society from a faculty lounge is very different from having, frankly, the experiences we probably both have. And so the effect is to be emotionally vulnerabilized.
Right,
and
absolutely.
to try to spread that, frankly.
So in zip code economies, I think one of the things that surprised some of the people we visited the most is they would tell me their stories, and they were just impossible for me not to become glassy-eyed. I would become emotional. And that was the surprising thing, because then they were opening up and they saw that their stories moved me. They changed me as a person. And I fortunately didn't hear a story that, sad, but we heard many, many stories where people felt that they were being observed by people like me as opposed to being seen by people like me. And so you asked me that question, and I think this is the answer I want to give you. I've stopped being an observer. I'm trying every day to hold myself to a different standard. I want to be a seer. I want to see the people in front of me and really take in what they have to say.
I want to thank you for asking that question. One of the things, this is my 14th Ideas Festival, and one of the things I've noticed over the years is sometimes when you ask people about a personal question, they deflect it onto a public policy answer. And so it's nice to have more personal conversations in this space right here.
My question is, do you find that people want to stay in their zip code and make it better, or do they want to move to better zip codes?
So that was the surprising thing. Again, I mean, you can see why it's transformative. Every time I tell you something, so that was super surprising to me. But I thought that there would be, especially in East Palo Alto or Firebaugh, California, where there's not a lot of opportunity in their areas, they want to stay. So then you ask, why do you want to stay? And in Honolulu, why do you want to stay? Because this is my home. These are my social connections. I'm willing to take a job that maybe doesn't give me the kind of monetary wealth, as long as I have my connection wealth. And so what I left with, to be honest, is that it made me wonder, am I putting too much emphasis on a different kind of wealth, and I need to shift more? And the answer is absolutely. I mean, at one point, some people were telling me about why they didn't want to move from their communities, and that the woman described that she had been through a divorce, she was with an abusive person, and she said, my community is they're my shepherd in a sea of darkness. And I wanted to know, am I anyone's shepherd in a sea of darkness? Am I doing that? And so the answer is yes, they want to stay. And what makes them want to stay is the things that we miss in our economic models. They want to stay because of the connectivity.
Let's go right here.
I think Arturo Brennenburg, this is a fascinating discussion I'm an economist focused on international economics. So you obviously see the similar problems at the zip code level than at the country level. And one of the great frustrations for all economists is that we don't know the magic formula to tell a country how to change. So I wondered if you have come to any ideas on how to tell a zip code how to create that culture that is a positive culture as opposed to a negative culture.
So it's a hard question, and here's where I'm at right now. As an economist, and often as a policymaker, we need to be humble that we will not be able to find the magic answers. And instead of trying to simply insert ourselves with magic answers that then the communities try and sometimes leave them without the outcome, why don't we introduce communities to each other so that the communities of East Palo Alto, Firebaugh, Honolulu, all the ones in our towns, all the ones you met, they can help each other, because maybe we're instead of being the people who give answers, we should be the people who make markets. We should be doing that work. And so I have a different perspective of how we create change, and that is let people who are doing change talk to other people who need change.
So how do you think about the IMF and the World Bank? Because they are the answer experts.
Well, I'm just going to be, I'm not going to pick on the IMF and World Bank alone. I want the IMF, the Federal Reserve, all central banks in the world, governments in general, to realize that answer giving might have just too much hubris. We should be facilitating, we should be studying, but we should also be sourcing, crowdsourcing. I mean, crowdsourcing, this is one of the things I learned from reverse mentoring. Crowdsourcing really works. You get a lot of answers when you ask communities what has worked for you, and then you take those answers and I see myself now more than ever as a shepherd. a shepherd of answers that other people have, as opposed to the purveyor of answers that I've learned through introspection.
Okay, right over here.
Hi. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, and so I very much understand the wanting to come back to your community. But I also have watched my hometown die. I've watched epidemics run through there, and I have since moved to Louisville, and I'm an educator. So how do I convince people and tell, young talent that if you go back home, you're not wasting your talent, you're making things better, when I can physically see that I would have felt very much stuck and wasted there?
So that's a question that I answer this way, because I get asked that question a lot by young people, is that I say, life is a journey, and so you may need to leave for a while and then build up all the things that you want in order to go back and help. And so instead of thinking of it as 0-1 decision, I leave my community or stay in my community, I would like us all to be open to the idea that you stay some, you go some, you stay some, you go some, and that fluidity may help mobility, but it also might allow us to not put the entire burden of change on our very youngest people and actually ourselves. I mean, one of the things that we do as we get older, I think, is we have more opportunity to say, okay, for now it's for others. And so I don't discourage younger people if they want to go and build their reputation or skill set elsewhere. I don't discourage them. But if they yearn to go back home, I say, build and go back home. And also visit frequently. Go and talk to local schools. You can contribute to your community even if you don't live there. And you can live there later even if you don't live there now. So I just, that's not a very satisfying answer, but I think it is the answer we're going to have. These are complicated problems, and they're going to take complicated decisions and complicated paths. It's not going to be so easy to make that decision. You see this a lot, just as an add-on. You don't have to just look at zip codes, look at countries. We used to worry that emerging nations had brain drain, but now we're seeing a lot of countries get their talent back because people come and work in the United States for a while, and let's abstract from whether they feel comfortable here anymore or not, but let's just go to, I think they just return because home pulls, and you want your home to be a better place.
Let me ask you about one complication. So there are a lot of cities that Andre mentioned, that are super fast growing.
Right.
Charlotte. And you think, okay, they're creating so many new jobs. This must be great for the people born in Charlotte. And it turns out it's not. They're just importing labor to those jobs. The people born in Charlotte see no benefit.
Right.
So how do you think about that problem?
So that's an important problem that I see every day in the Bay Area. So in the Bay Area, we have people coming from all over the United States. They have really high salaries. They tend to displace. In San Francisco, it will be 10 years and we might not have anybody who is a teacher or a firefighter or a police officer. And these are jobs. These are not, these are important jobs and good incomes, but they're not nearly as good enough to compete with an imported talent who works at a high-tech company. So the answer, in my mind, is that we need to have wraparound. We need to build resilient communities. One of the focuses of the San Francisco Fed is how do we build not only solve affordable housing, but how do we start thinking of a wraparound, a resilient community where the whole community weathers the ups and downs of the economy, and we have enough diversity and inclusion that we can actually grow as a unit. And that again goes back to bringing local leaders together with private sector businesses and community groups and the people. And the main thing I think my job is to articulate the value proposition to businesses about why having a community that's completely tilted to the only people who live there, the people who work in your highest paid jobs, that's not going to be the resiliency you want. So, not to plug for a conference we're doing, but I told you we run this Fed Listens campaign for the whole year, and one of the San Francisco Fed's hosting one of these in September, and you're welcome to come. It's on the cost and benefits of a hot economy, and it tries to go right to this. Hot with displacement isn't what we think about when we think a hot economy and drawing in, because ultimately we want an inclusive economy.
Right. Is there one more question? Maybe right up front here. This will be our last question.
Back to the personal, I'm really struck by your story and by how you've overcome so much. And I'm sort of curious what resources you called upon in your life. Some people would call that grace, some people would call that grit. What was it that propelled you through incredible adversity as a child, through lots of challenges that you've faced in so many different dimensions? And how do we cultivate more of that in our culture to empower people who are struggling?
So I look back on it, the most important skill that I was able to develop is really not a skill like we typically think of it. It's really just a sense of being resilient. And I think I have a lot of gratitude for having a reasonably good draw on resiliency, but I also met early on in my life, at 15, and I actually tell this story just recently. It's not something I've typically shared. I just told it at a commencement speech I gave that, my whole world had imploded when I was 15, and I felt terrible. I was at sea, essentially. So then a guidance counselor, I dropped out of school, a guidance counselor from the high school I was attending before I dropped out, she has a friend, and she says, I think you would, if you met Betsy, she would help you. So I go and I get in her car, and she has this beautiful car. It's a Mercedes, and it's the best car I've ever been in my life, and it just feels like a safe environment. And I'm looking to her for answers and some comfort, and she says these words to me. She says, Mary, you have to bloom where you're planted. And I was so upset. I really felt so let down. Here's this adult, she's got this really nice car. I feel completely unsafe and unmoored, and she says you have to bloom where you're planted, so she just said it again. Just gently the next time. You have to bloom where you're planted. And I took that to heart, and it allowed me to say, okay, instead of thinking my life is over because I'm planted in concrete or a desert that has no other flowers, I'm just going to muscle through, and I'm going to look for resources. And that's what I'd like us to be able to do, is to hold people, to be validating and seeing that their experiences are challenging, but to also know that they have the stuff in them to be able to say something like you have to bloom where you're planted. And holding both of those simultaneously is not easy, but if we can be brave enough to do that, I believe we can affect change.
And one of my mentors when I was a kid or a young man, was Milton Friedman. And
You were lucky.
I was lucky. He was a very good man. But he grew up in an era when economics was thought of a little like physics, or aspired to be physics. And I am glad that you are helping us graduate beyond that. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.